So how difficult is it going to be to get the manufacturing platform going again, since it depends so heavily on people who have gone back to the provinces, back to their homes, and may be ill, and travel may be difficult. So how complex is it going to be to resume the Chinese manufacturing engine?
Well, I mean, I think initially it was very difficult. The reports I've seen suggest that actually, in many cases, they have resumed production, at least something close to what it was before, not necessarily at the same levels. Actually, what people are even more worried about now are service sector jobs that migrant workers had, and the challenge with the service side is there's also the demand issue, not just the supply issue of whether the workers can get back there, but the fact that urbanites, may not be ready to go to the restaurants that the migrant workers worked in, or other services that the migrant workers were employed in. So there's a real concern now about, particularly about service industry jobs, and particularly for migrant workers. I should say there's different estimates out about what the unemployment problem is in China right now. But the general growing consensus is it's going to be very, very, it's going to, COVID-19 is going to provide a serious shock to employment, creating huge unemployment in China throughout the year. Even as the economy starts to recover to a degree, they're about ready to get a second shock from the rest of us in the world as the global economy slows down. And they can't expect Americans or other people to be buying many Chinese goods going forward. There's one Chinese economist has estimated that 200 million people are either unemployed or have not been able to return to their jobs. And that's like a quarter of the workforce.
200 million? 200 million?
That's one estimate. Others, I mean, UBS had a different estimate, which was lower, but was also, I can't remember exactly what it was, quite a bit lower, but also quite shocking. To put it in perspective, in the 2008 global financial crisis, I can't remember the exact numbers, maybe 20 million people were out of work, particularly down in the factories in Guangdong. And then the other big wave of layoffs that we've seen in China goes way back to former Premier Zhu Rongji when he reformed the state enterprise sector. At that point, the estimate that was out was 30 million people lost their jobs. And that was seen as a shock. I remember writing about it, and people always compared it and say, well, this is equivalent roughly to the population of France have lost their jobs, and real worries about social instability back then. We're talking about something that will be several factors higher than that this year.
So we're talking a lot about the narrative about what happened, and that the Chinese government is trying to control the narrative and trying to portray themselves as being, having responded forcefully and well, and being heroes to the world. We'll come to more of the international dimension of this, but let's stay focused on the domestic for just one more moment. So the government is trying to demonstrate that it was early in recognizing this, although we know Dr. Lee and others were trying to warn about it, and they were repressed. Local officials were shut down. So, I mean, how dangerous is this for the party's legitimacy and control if a large number of Chinese people begin to believe that the party blew it, the party didn't know what it was doing?
Well, my understanding is that there's sort of three stages to the Chinese official response, and the first one is the serious blunder where they covered it up, and there's research that shows that just delaying by 1 week, meant that 60%, or rather 1 week earlier, dealing with the situation in China could have reduced overall infections by 60%, and I think 3 weeks earlier, something like 90%. So there was a real cost to that initial cover up and blundering part. The second part, was what a lot of the world's paying attention to now, which is this quite impressive effort to, sometimes using draconian means, but the quite impressive effort that really did bring infection rates and deaths way down. And frankly, what's happening in the U.S. right now is makes we look awful, and it is awful. It's a tragedy here because of our poor response up until now in the U.S. The third part was this sort of we're back in business, and gets to the point where that you just mentioned, the leadership trying to use this sort of to push soft power and create a new narrative, which says, forget about the first part, that never happened. And here, now focus on this, we had this dramatically successful control effort, and now we're back in business. So my understanding is there's a lot of, certainly in the cities, there's a lot of support now for the Communist Party. They look at the second part and they say, wow, the party's wonderful. They look at what's happening in the US and they were like, I'm glad I'm not living in the US. You know, and they're sending masks to their friends here in the US now from China. But whether or not that support will last is an open question, particularly as we see some of the real economic fallout going forward, which I mentioned with what I'm expecting, very, very high unemployment later this year.